Victoria 3 launched with rather sky-high expectations, but let's be honest, I think everybody knows and can admit it was a mess. I, along with most people, was very excited when Victoria 3 was first announced. Victoria 2 was a bit of a sleeper hit, cult classic, not very popular in the mainstream gaming media at all, but for strategy players, it was definitely one of the GOATs. So when Victoria 3 was finally announced, I think everybody was excited. It was actually a pretty big meme at the time in the Paradox community. With every single announcement, people always said it was going to be Victoria 3. But why was Victoria 3 such a mess at launch? Well, simply put, it had very messy core mechanics that lacked depth, like trade, shallow and buggy warfare, an economy that didn't feel very alive or reactive. But after numerous patches, DLCs, and updates, is it finally the game that players wanted? Well, no, not really, spoiler alert, but it definitely has made a lot of improvements. So today I wanted to dive into Victoria's 3 current state to see if it is finally worth your time, or if Paradox still has a lot of work to do. So when the game first released, there was a lot of issues. I will say, in my opinion, even on release, the game was fun and playable, but there was a lot of issues. I think the most cited issue was the war system, where you had no control over troops at all, and the front lines would constantly do weird things like split for no reason, or force your army to take a weird way to the front line, or there was even the bugs where your army would just teleport back to your HQ. There was a lot of issues. And then there was also the issue of only allowing one battle per front line, no matter how big the front line was. I remember playing as Russia and invading China, and over the whole border, which in real life is something like 2,600 miles, there was only one battle happening, even though hundreds of thousands of troops were mobilized. There's 500,000 men wanting to fight, and we gotta wait for these 20,000 troops to finish battling it out before we send the next wave. It was a little ridiculous. The politics were also a lot less fleshed out. You had to mix and match your own political groups to have a legitimate government. It didn't just now, like it does, show you the most legitimate governments you could make, so you could be stuck there a while trying to mix and match. There was also the issues and I'll call it gaminess around revolutions. What's obviously during the time of Victoria 3, so 1836 to 1936, were a huge deal. I mean, the springtime of revolution occurred in 1848, where tons of countries in Europe experienced revolts and mass protests. But originally in-game, revolts were essentially a non-issue because the game rules had it set up where your capital could not rebel, no matter what. Even if everybody in your country hated your government, your capital would never revolt. So what could you do to win any civil war? You could just only build military buildings and barracks in your capital. That way, when the country splits apart, even if only your capital remains under your control, you have control over the whole military and military-industrial complex. They also lacked real ethnic revolts, which were somewhat of a mainstay during the Victorian era. I mean, the rise of nationalism obviously led to a lot of ethnic groups wanting their own countries. Playing as the Austrian Empire was a cakewalk, even though historically, they had a rather hard time managing a multi-ethnic empire full of people who did not want to be part of an empire, and they were in no way ready for industrialization. Diplomacy also felt really off in game because it was super hard to gauge whether or not countries were actually going to do something about your diplomatic actions, and it always felt rather arbitrary. I mean, sometimes as a minor nation you were able to fight and conquer territory no problem, and then you try to conquer some inconsequential piece of land, and now the United Kingdom is getting involved and is about to rape you for seemingly no reason. Now, of course, in real life, real politics exists. Every single country has their own needs and reasons for choosing to intervene or not. But in real life, countries also have a bit more information on the intentions of your government and your country. It wouldn't be a big shock in real life when somebody chooses to intervene because, obviously, your government would probably have some sort of clue why they were going to, or if they would want to or not. Another big issue with the game was every country having essentially no flavor. I mean, every country played the exact same. There was barely anything unique about each nation except for maybe the names of political parties, or maybe there's a couple journal entries about something big that was happening in the country at the time. I mean, it didn't matter whether you were playing as the United Kingdom or as Egypt. It felt the exact same. Playing as the premier power in the world felt the exact same as playing as a tribal nation in Africa, when obviously that's not how it should be. So enough with bitching about how bad the game was. Let's talk about how the game is now, and let's see if it's improved or maybe hasn't improved. So obviously since release, a lot of DLC and free patches have come out. So with the DLC, which most of it has been flavor packs, which basically add exclusive content and flavor to a continent or a specific country, like Colossus of the South, which added flavor and content to Brazil and South America, or their latest DLC, Pivot of Empire, which adds some flavor and unique systems to India. So these DLCs are hated by some for what they see as monetizing things that already should have been in-game. I don't share that opinion. I think this is a pretty good way to increase the longevity of the game, and also allows players to buy the flavor that they want. So I mean, if you don't care about India, don't buy the Indian DLC. If you don't care about Brazil or South America, don't buy the Brazilian flavor pack. I think it definitely allows you to mix and match and pay for what you want. Especially since along with these DLC releases, they always coincide with a new free patch that adds everything to the game that you get with that DLC except for the flavor for the countries. Another big fix that has been added is the economy. It has been given a lot more depth. So previously, at release, the game did not have autonomous construction at all. It was on you to build everything in your country, even if you had a laissez-faire economic system, otherwise known as free market capitalism, where the whole point is that the government doesn't intervene in the economy. The game still had that modeled by having you still build everything. The pops would just put a pile of money in place, and you could use that pile of money to build things for free. So they actually did add that a little bit after release, but they have decided to flesh out the system even more. So now the economic system in games operates a lot more like an actual economic system. Buildings are now government owned or privately owned. There is a private building queue, which allows the wealthy of your country to pay for their own building. And they build based off of what would make them money, which also helps make the economic system feel a lot more realistic. If your country is suffering from a lack of tools, then capitalists will pay to build tool factories because it's profitable. Or during a war, they will choose to build more weapons factories because that's in high demand. That's where the money is. And they finally added foreign investment, which, thank God, that was a big complaint for a long time, where if you vassalize a country or sign a deal with it, you and your wealthy elite can build in other countries, and that allows you to exploit their resources that they're not and pocket all the profits from that building. So you get to use their labor, but you get to reap all the rewards from it. These new economic changes have breathed a lot of life into what is supposed to be one of the staples of the game, and that is the game being an economic sandbox. Now, the economy actually functions a lot more like an actual economy instead of an extremely gamified version of one. Another new great addition is the all-new culture and politics rework. Now, cultures are actually able to be discriminated against, which obviously is bad. Don't discriminate, but I'm glad they finally added it to the game. Before, cultures were discriminated against, but now there's actually levels to it. From some cultures being considered completely undesirable, to other cultures being more treated as second-class citizens, which I think adds a lot of depth and shows a more realistic look at how discrimination actually worked back then and even now. So I mean, even in my own country, America, during the Victorian era, immigrants were looked down upon. But some more than others, and then below white immigrants, people still look down upon black people even more. I mean, who knew racism could be so complex? But I think that shows an actual, more historical, realistic look. Obviously, people liked immigrants from the UK a lot more than they liked immigrants from Italy or from Eastern Europe. So I'm glad that the game decided to actually finally model that. Along with discrimination being added, there are now actual political movements in game that actually stick around and are able to be propped up or taken down. Now, political movements and revolutionary movements don't just exist whenever a revolution is about to occur. So, for example, when the game first released, let's say that you wanted to abolish slavery in the US. So you attempt to pass a no slavery law, and then out of nowhere, a revolutionary group springs up that wants to defend the institution of slavery. Well, now in game, that pro-slavery group will have its own tab from the start of the game, and it will always be present that you can interact with and see how many people support it, what political parties support it, instead of it just existing only when shit actually hits the fan. It also added political movements for almost anything you can think of, whether it's liberal movements or modernization movements, or they finally added all the ethnic movements to the Austrian empires and other countries with a lot of ethnic minorities. So it actually simulates a lot better the real political dynamics of the time. Warfare has gotten marginally better. They added the ability to designate what state you want your armies to march towards, and they fixed a lot of the front line issues so that they don't break apart as much. But other than that, not much has changed for War. I feel like they're waiting to add more systematic changes for a new War DLC. And I mean, without a doubt, the War in-game is probably the weakest link, but ultimately this game is supposed to be more focused on diplomacy and economic building, which is probably Paradox's excuse for why War is so weak. But, I mean, it kind of sucks because diplomacy is also still pretty ass in game. So they have added some more features which help, like now when you start a diplomatic play, it will show you how every country able to intervene feels about both sides of the conflict, and it tells you if they're more likely to intervene for a side. But other than that, there's no marked improvement in the diplomatic arena. I mean, even though diplomacy is supposed to be the name of the game, you're still not able to add war goals during a war or intervene after a war has already started. I mean, with the current diplomatic system, World War I can't even be properly simulated in-game, which just shows you how shallow the system is. I mean, even Victoria 2 had it to where you could add war goals during a war and intervene into an ongoing conflict. So, is Victoria 3 complete? Definitely not. But I think it's finally starting to resemble the grand strategy game that we all hoped for when it was first announced. It's not perfect, but it has undeniably been improved. So, what do you think? Has Victoria 3 redeemed itself? Is it still a letdown? Let me know. If you enjoyed this video, like, subscribe, upload a video every Tuesday, and please remember that Jesus loves you.